The Fallout series has had a considerable transformation over the last console generation. Fallout first started as a third-person, turn-based isometric RPG on the PC, but during the PS3 Xbox 360 era, Fallout evolved into a first-person shooter with RPG elements. With the evolution of the series came an increase in the player base of the Fallout series, as Fallout 3 made the series more accessible to a wider audience. Critics have also praised Fallout 3 for its open world, its combat, and its RPG elements. But is Fallout 3 really as good as everybody says it is, or is it overrated? For those who are unfamiliar with the Fallout universe, the Fallout games take place in an alternate version of the United States, where 1950s culture dominated the American landscape. However, once the Great War took place between the United States, China, and other nuclear-armed countries in 2077, the landscape of the world was transformed into a wasteland. Fallout 3 takes place 200 years after your initial destruction, in the remnants of the Washington, D.C. area. In Fallout 3, you play as the lone wanderer from Vault 101 who sets out to find their dad after he mysteriously leaves the vault one night. While traveling through the wasteland, you gather information as to the whereabouts of your father, until you find him in Vault 112. Once you find your father, he explains that the reason he left the vault was to restart Project Purity, a project that he and your mother worked on before you were born, which would bring clean drinking water to the wasteland. At this point, you head to Rivet City to gather the former members of the Project Purity team. After you reassemble the Project Purity team and make your way to the Jefferson Memorial, the Enclave ambushes the project and demands the code to start the purifier. However, your father decides to sacrifice himself in order to prevent the Enclave from activating Project Purity by flooding the purifier room with radiation. You then make your way with the remaining Project Purity team through an underground passage to the Brotherhood of Steel compound, where you get information on the location of a Garden of Eden creation kit, or GECK, which is the key to getting the purifier to work. However, once you find the GECK, you are captured by Enclave soldiers and taken to Raven Rock, where you meet the President, who proposes that you inject a virus into the purifier that will kill all non-humans. Once leaving Raven Rock and returning to the Brotherhood of Steel, you make your way back to Project Purity and turn on the purifier. As far as the story goes, Fallout 3 is not half bad. Even though the story can pretty much be separated into two halves, the first where you're looking for your father, and the second where you're trying to get the purifier to work, most of the areas that the story has you go to are pretty interesting to explore, like the Science Museum, Raven Rock, and Vault 112, which has you explore a virtual world in order to find your father. That being said, I felt that the story really fell apart at the end. First off, after you start the final mission, you are unable to go back and explore the wasteland, or do any quests that you might have missed, so you have to make sure you have an extra save file you can go back to. The decision to have a definitive ending in an open game like Fallout 3 is such a weird decision, because honestly, who's gonna complete and explore everything there is to do and see before they start the final mission? Probably not too many people. Most people would like to complete the story mission first, so they can move on to the side quest, especially if they want to know what happens next in the story. Second, the final mission itself is pretty disappointing. On paper it sounds really cool, as you have to lead a giant robot to the Jefferson Memorial while Enclave soldiers attack you. But in reality, the robot and the Brotherhood of Steel soldiers can easily take care of themselves, so you're more or less the one that's being escorted. And once you reach the Jefferson Memorial, there's little opposition inside. There are about 4 soldiers in Colonel Autumn who are easy to dispose of. Speaking of which, why is Colonel Autumn still alive? I mean, he was in the room your father flooded with radiation, so how come he isn't dead? Well, if you can believe it, according to the Fallout Wiki, Colonel Autumn apparently injected himself with some sort of advanced Rad-X or Radaway, which allowed him to survive. And if you look very closely, you can kind of see him doing some weird thing with his arm, which I guess is him injecting himself. Now why is this important? Well, it's important because of the fact that during the ending, in order to turn on the purifier, you or Sir Lance have to sacrifice yourself. Now I'm assuming what the developers were going for with your character sacrificing themselves was that you were fulfilling your parents' dreams by completing the project they spent their lives working on. What I see it as though is the developers being incredibly lazy. For one, like I said before, on completion of this mission, this ends the game. There's no going back to do other quests, and considering that the story has a relatively short quest line, it's pretty easy to end up completing the story before you even really get a chance to explore the wasteland. And by the way, it doesn't matter if you send Sarah in, you still can't return and continue playing the game from after the activation of the purifier. Second, the fact that the player character dies for emptying the chamber doesn't make a whole lot of sense. If Colonel Autumn was able to survive wearing the outfit he was wearing and by injecting himself with Rad-X or Radaway, then there's no reason my player character couldn't have survived by wearing power armor and by injecting himself with radiation reducing items. I mean, it's not like the door automatically locks behind you, otherwise Colonel Autumn wouldn't have been able to escape, and even if it did, there are people on the other side of the chamber who can unlock it. Next, I had a partner with me who was immune to radiation, who could have turned off the purifier for me, but wouldn't. And do you want to know the reason why they refused to go in there? It's because apparently it's your destiny, which is complete bullshit. I mean, really? Why would the developers think that anyone would be okay with that reasoning? It just seems like they finished making the game, and then someone remembered that one of your party members who was immune to radiation could be with you during this scene, and so they just decided to throw in that destiny line and call it a day. Of course, what really pisses me off about all of this is that if you have the Broken Steel DLC and you choose to start the Purifier, you end up waking up 2 weeks later and are able to continue playing the game from where you left off. Why this couldn't have been patched into the main game is beyond me, and quite frankly bullshit, since you have to buy the DLC if you want to continue the game after you finish the story quests. I mean, this is a huge change to the ending of the game. How the developers could just prevent people from seeing this change to the ending is ridiculous. And yes, I know the Broken Steel DLC does more than just change the ending, but I'm not really interested in the DLC. What I am interested in is the main story that the game has, that the developers felt like changing after the fact without letting everyone experience the new ending. Moving on from the story, let's look at the character creation. In most games, when you create your character, you usually choose how they look and pick their class or allocate any skill points before you even start playing the game. However, Fallout 3 actually handles character creation a bit differently, as you start by seeing your character born and choose how they'll look in the future. And as your character grows up, you get to allocate their special points by looking through a picture book when they are a baby, and choose what skills they specialize in by taking a placement exam when they're an adult. I like the fact that the developers decided to integrate the character creation into the main game instead of just having the generic create a character menu. In this way, you actually feel more connected to your character since you've watched them grow up. The only bad thing about the character creation though is the limited number of options you have for their appearance. Most of the characters' faces look like their skin is melting off, and no matter what complexion you choose, your character's skin color will have a yellowish hue. The hairstyles you can choose from are also god-awful, as most either have a 1950s vibe or just plain ridiculous looking. As far as your character's stats are concerned, Fallout 3 has primary stats, derived stats, skills, and perks, which factor into your character's performance. Starting off, your primary stats are Strength, Perception, Endurance, Charisma, Intelligence, Agility, and Luck. In Fallout, this is known as the Special System. When you first start the game, you're given 40 points to place in each attribute. However, you cannot place more than 10 or less than 1 point into each stat, so really you can place 33 points into whatever category you want. During the course of the game, you can increase your special points with certain items or armor by finding Vault-Tec bobbleheads or with certain perks. Depending on how many points you have in a certain stat can give you special dialogue options during conversations, but the special system mainly decides your derived stats. Now, derived stats are attributes of your character which are based on the character's primary stats. The derived stats in Fallout 3 are action points, carry weight, critical chance, damage resistance, fire resistance, health, melee damage, poison damage, radiation resistance, and unarmed damage. Depending on how many points you have in your primary stats, affect how high your derived stats are. So for example, if you have a strength of 10, you'll have a higher carry weight than someone with a strength of 5. Primary stats also have a slight effect on skills, usually raising each skill by 2 points. There are 13 skills in the game: big guns, energy weapons, explosives, melee weapons, small guns, unarmed, lockpick, medicine, repair, science, sneak, barter, and speech. At the beginning of the game, after you take the GOAT exam, you'll be able to tag 3 skills which give you a permanent boost of 15 points. Every time you gain a level, you'll also be able to put more points into skills, with the number of points you have to allocate contingent on your intelligence, with a higher intelligence giving you more skill points. And like special stats, you can also increase skills by finding Vault-Tech bobbleheads. Having more points in skills determines how proficient you are in that skill. So for example, the more points you have in small guns, the greater amount of damage you can do with guns. Certain actions also require a certain amount of skill points, like lockpicking, as average locks require 50 points in the lockpicking skill, where easy locks only require 25 points. With every level you gain, you'll also be able to choose from a list of perks that can grant you a special ability. The perks you're allowed to choose from depend on your level, and if you meet the special or skill requirements for that perk. For example, in order to choose the Cyborg perk, you need to be at least level 14 and have 60 points in both medicine and science. Now from the sound of it, it seems pretty complex, but once you play through the game, it all becomes easier to understand. The only problem with the level up system in the game, though, is it's pretty broken in the player's favor, as it's incredibly easy to level up your skills if you put a lot of points into intelligence early on, and take the educated perk, as you could have over 20 points per level to put towards your skills. For instance, at level 20, my character was completely overpowered, with a lot of my skills being in the 80s. And if you had the Broken Steel DLC, the level cap is raised to 30, making it even easier to level yourself up. The combat in Fallout 3 is a huge divergence from the original Fallout games. Instead of having a turn-based system, the combat is in real time, and is similar to first-person action games, with a few tweaks. For one, damage is contingent on how many points you have in a skill, and not based upon how strong a weapon is. So for instance, if I had a bat with a base damage of 7, and a pistol with a base damage of 6, in most games you'd see that the bat does more damage. However, if you have more points in small guns than in melee weapons, the pistol will do more damage. Second, targeting with guns is also a little strange, as there aren't any iron sights. Instead, when you zoom in, the targeting reticule moves a little closer to the screen. To alleviate some of the targeting issues, Fallout 3 introduced the Vault-Tech Assisted Targeting System, or VATS, which allows you to specifically target parts of the enemy's bodies. Depending on how far away you are from the target determines the chance of you being able to hit them. Each limb of a target also has a specific health bar, and by depleting that bar, that character's limb will be crippled, which produces different effects depending on which body part is crippled. For example, crippling an enemy's arm will cause them to drop their weapon, while crippling their head will cause them to have trouble shooting you. As well as making it easier to hit enemies, VATS can also make it easier to find them as well, since sometimes enemies might be able to see you before you can see them. Overall, I feel like the combat in Fallout 3 just doesn't work very well. Unloading a whole clip into someone just to kill them is pretty ridiculous, especially if they're a human. I mean, I can understand a super mutant needing more than a few bullets to take down, but you can't tell me it takes more than 5 bullets to kill a raider, who's practically naked. Conversely, VATS is completely overpowered, as you take 90% less damage while in VATS, while at the same time you're able to deal a shit ton of damage, if not outright kill the enemy just by pressing one button. As far as the weapons themselves, there's not really a lot of variation. For example, if you want to use an assault rifle, your only choices are the standard assault rifle or the Chinese assault rifle. It's the same thing for shotguns, as your only choices are the sawed-off or combat shotgun. Since there are so few choices as far as some weapon types are concerned, it kinda takes the fun out of replaying the game, considering that you're probably going to end up coming across and using the same weapons every playthrough. One thing you'll notice about the weapons and armor in the game is that they degrade through use or damage. Basically, each time you use a weapon or are shot at, your weapons and armor condition will go down, meaning that weapons will deal less damage and will increasingly jam when trying to reload, and armor will protect against less damage. In order to repair weapons or armor, you need to find another weapon or armor of the same type. So if you need to repair your 10mm pistol, you need another 10mm pistol. How much the weapon or armor is repaired is based on your repair skill. If you are unable to find a similar weapon to repair the one you have, you can usually have a shop owner repair it for a price, depending on how bad of condition the weapon is in. In the beginning of the game, it can be difficult to find similar items to repair your equipment with, or find enough caps to be able to pay for your equipment repairs, so you kinda have to be careful about using some weapons. Later on though, this becomes less of a problem, as you have access to better shops and fight enemies that carry the same type of gun you use, or wear the same type of armor. Overall, I don't really mind the repair mechanic. I think it adds to the survival aspect of the game, considering that weapons and armor would be more scarce in a post-apocalyptic world. Although I will say the concept of jury-rigging 2 weapons together in order to fix one is a bit far-fetched. Now, probably one of the most appealing aspects of Fallout 3 is the ability to freely explore the capital wasteland. There are about 161 locations in the game, a few of which you'll come across through story missions and quests you receive, but a lot of the locations can only be discovered by wandering around the wasteland. Overall, it's pretty rewarding to just walk around and find a new town or building to explore. However, considering there are so many locations, sometimes it can be a bit overwhelming to just head out into the wasteland without an objective. There's also the fact that sometimes you'll uncover quests earlier than you were supposed to. Case in point, upon discovering this hotel, I picked up the Riley's Ranger's quest and completed it without finding or going to the Ranger compound first. I also remember my first playthrough that I completely skipped over meeting Three Dog and changing out the dish at the Washington Memorial. In a way, it's nice to be able to skip large portions of quests, especially if you played the game before. But on the other hand, if it's your first time playing, some interactions you have with people might be a little confusing, seeing as how you could miss important information pertaining to the quest. The open world aspect of Fallout 3 also at times can be a bit boring, considering that the capital wasteland is pretty devoid of any life and is really dull. A lot of the areas you explore are also pretty similar in appearance, as you'll either be exploring an old subway, a burned-out office building, or an empty vault. There are a few areas that are interesting to explore, like Oasis, but overall, most buildings have the same green-gray color scheme throughout. And I get that that's the point, that it's supposed to be a barren wasteland, but after a while, everywhere you visit just seems like a carbon copy of a place you've already been to. Not only that, but navigating through the Washington DC area, the capital wasteland is kind of a bitch. Most of the time, you can't simply walk from one place to another, as there's a ton of rubble blocking your path. So instead, you're forced to go through the subway system, which is really annoying, seeing as how every subway looks exactly the same. Also, having to enter the subway just to get to a new location in the DC area kinda takes all the fun out of exploring. If you played Fallout 3 before, then you might know how glitchy the game can be, especially on consoles. Considering that it's been 5 years since the game was released, there have been numerous patches that have gotten rid of most of the bugs. That being said, I noticed a few glitches while playing. During the game, there are a few instances wherein you have to escort other characters, and several times during these segments, the people who were following me were just frozen in place, and I had to either go back and get them, or continue along and hope they would start following me again. There were also a few times when characters would just run away from me for no reason, even though there were no enemies in that area. And again, I just had to press on and hope they would catch up. Other notable bugs during my playthrough were getting stuck on a rock and not being able to escape until I warped to a different location, the game freezing on at least 2 occasions, and dead characters writhing around on the ground. Overall, compared to my previous playthroughs, the game ran much smoother, considering that the first time I ever played Fallout 3, the game practically froze every 30 minutes. But still, that doesn't necessarily excuse the glitches that are still present. Earlier, I briefly made mention of the fact that you could have companions in the game. There are 8 possible companions in Fallout 3, but at most you can have 2 with you at a time. Usually every time I play, I avoid having anyone join me, because they either get in the way, or they make enemy encounters way too easy. Companions can also permanently die, which is another reason I avoid having them, since I don't really want to worry about keeping them and me alive in a firefight. So what's the deal? Is this game overrated? I would have to say it is. I think the story starts off strong, but ends on a very unsatisfying note. I also don't think the combat is all that enjoyable. I think the level up system is a tad too broken to the point where encounters with enemies becomes a joke, and exploring the wasteland can be tiring after coming across all too familiar set pieces. I'm also aware of the fact that fans of the previous Fallout games might take issue with the fact that the lore of Fallout 3 doesn't really match up with the previous games, and that the combat interactions with NPCs may feel stripped of the charm that the original Fallout games had. But considering that Fallout 3 was my first introduction to the series, I can't really speak to those issues, but it is something to be aware of. But overall, I would say that Fallout 3 just does a bad job at mixing genres, as people who are fans of shooters might be upset at how ineffective weapons are at the start of the game, while fans of RPGs might be upset at the fact that the game's too much of a shooter. Overall, I'd say Fallout 3 is at least worth playing as the experience can be pretty enjoyable. Just don't expect to be blown away.